Game loaded.
So we are live. Welcome everybody to the Lessons Learned podcast and channel with me, Lessons Learned, and we have Justin from NerdSlayer. In the hour, we're going to be talking about his channel and in some of the things that he specializes in, which is the analysis of mostly MMOs, but not exclusively, and mostly the MMOs that have failed and why. And we're going to be talking also a little bit, perhaps also about how things are made, and when it comes to YouTube and Twitch, etc. We're going to talk several subjects, but the focus today is going to be basically the history of MMOs, especially in the 2000s and 2000 to the teens of today. Justin, you begin most of your videos talking about in the death of an MMO, or death of a game. You have, at least, if I remember correctly, two criteria for a death of a game. If it's a massive multi-online player game, that the player count falls to a point where it's no longer sustainable, or that the parent company, developer or publisher no longer supports it.
Yeah, I would say, so as my videos have progressed, I've sort of gone away from doing as much explanation in the very beginning. But when I used to do it, I used to classify it as a drop in players, or a say the company just ceased to exist. And then the one of the other ones that I put as a category, which is obvious, would just be the game is actually dead, which is not always the case. And by the way, I just realized, why is my video not going?
Yes, we're I'm sorry, perhaps problem with the camera, folks. This happens on live shows. Like, you're watching it live here on Twitch, so enjoy. For those who are familiar, especially joining us on Justin's Discord, we were talking about the way he approaches games and what he considers to be a dead game or not a dead game. He was explaining that he no longer does not much explanation of that category, but goes for game population, failure to sustain the game by the developer, or simply the fact that the game is no longer available. Truly dead game. Now, I find it very interesting because MMOs are not something that is relatively new. It's all, at least all the way back to the 1970s with MUDs and the equivalent. For example, in the 1980s, you could play one of the first proto MMOs on, I believe it was one of the online servers, CompuServe, and that was Neverwinter Nights. But as far as I can recall, the MMO that put the game on the map and the company that did so was Origin with Ultima Online. However, it wasn't until the one MMO everybody knows and hates to love and loves to hate, World of Warcraft, that we had numbers in the millions, right? That it wasn't just another type of game. It was extremely popular. And that, I think, led to a rush of companies, perhaps companies that were already planning to do MMOs and rushed them to put them out there, or companies that, no, we can actually do this. You know, we can actually compete and become, of course, the WoW killer, etc. And that seems to be very much the history of the 2000s. A lot of companies, both in the United States and in the Pacific, specifically in Korea, setting up their own MMOs, competing against each other, and ultimately trying to compete with World of Warcraft. What are some of the common attributes that a lot of these MMOs had in this era? You say when you look at MMOs, oh, this is an MMORPG, this is what they were going for, this is what tended to attract players at this time.
Right. Yeah. So the early 2000s, late 90s, the MMOs in this period were a lot more about adventuring Adventuring was probably the biggest part of the game. So progression in the traditional sense was more like progressing through the actual game. And there was leveling, but it was more so like leveling always felt like it was a auxiliary part of the game. It didn't feel like it was the main focus
Mhm.
because you could experience the game from as early as level 1. When World of Warcraft came out, that kind of really changed a lot of things. Things became a lot more about what level you were you this high enough level in order to do this content and do this and that. And then, of course, as the 2000s went up to the period of 2009 to 2011, that's where you see, I mean, I think there was like 30 MMOs or something in that time period. There's a lot of MMOs, and all of those MMOs took what WoW did or tried to take what WoW did and expanded on that, made things more about instant gratification, arena combats, fast travel, and less of the original thing, the original adventure aspect of MMOs, where it was a lot. There wasn't really fast travel. If you look at early Ultima Online, if you look at EverQuest, you had to pay somebody to portal you somewhere, a mage in most cases, or you had to pay someone to set up a camp, like some ranger or hunter. Even in early Lord of the Rings, did that as well. So I would probably say the biggest shifts were from being less adventure, less freeform, to more sectionalized, more structured, and more instant gratification.
So we're talking about because when you use terms like theme park and sandbox and
Right.
open world, would the earlier MMOs, like again Ultima Online, which is the one that really sticks in my mind, but not the only one, were more sandbox. You know, you could have careers, you could build a home, you could do things like that, and it was all about adventuring, exploring, and stuff like World of Warcraft would be more like a theme park, or is that not an
No,
accurate description?
that's true. Yeah. So the most popular sandboxes is probably, or where I guess was, because some of them don't exist anymore. But the
Mhm.
biggest ones were Ultima Online. There was Asheron's Call.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Shadowbane was one, but it didn't exist for very long. And then DAOC was a bit of a mixture of a sandbox and a more structured game when compared to those two games.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, funny enough, people attribute WoW to being the first theme park, but it technically, like, as for what the term itself means,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that EverQuest really was the first theme park. EverQuest 1 wasn't as much of a theme park as, say, EverQuest 2 or then the subsequent MMOs like World of Warcraft, but EverQuest 1 was more structured than DAOC, Dark Age of Camelot, or Ultima Online. And then, of course, WoW basically took what EverQuest did and made it even easier to access. And people will refer to early WoW as vanilla WoW,
Mm-hmm.
and that one wasn't as structured.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was less structured because there wasn't fast travel everywhere, and it copied a lot of mechanics from EverQuest in the sense that you had portals and people could get summoned by a warlock, etc. But then as the new expansion came out, I think the first one was Burning Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
That's really when the game started to become more and more streamlined, aka a theme park. And then subsequent games after that, I'd say from 2005 all the way to 2009 or 10, we're almost even 2011, we're almost exclusively theme park games. It wasn't until 2014 that you started to see more sandboxes or sandbox hybrids, like Arcade, for example, that came out in 2014. Came out in America. And then if you look at the market now, it's almost been like cyclical, and that
Yeah.
it's come back to being sandboxes where you see all these crowdfunded games like Star Citizen,
Mm-hmm.
Camelot Unchained, and then Crowfall. So yeah, the market's become a little bit cyclical, and
Yeah.
it's kind of gone back to its roots.
Yeah, I mean, it also, again, a lot of people attribute World of Warcraft to being an innovator, but in fact, my experience and the experience of people who were playing at the time was like they could see the traces from other games. Blizzard perhaps had the right alchemic mix where they could take those elements and put them in a package that at the time seemed the most attractive package. Which brings us to what brings specific players to specific games. We've seen, for example, I think two trends. Companies making an MMO that, their own version of MMO, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi, whatever. And then companies trying to do the World of Warcraft thing in a sense that they take an established IP, whether it's a video game IP or not. Say Star Wars, Conan, there's two examples on top of my head, and try to make an MMO out of that. And I think when people thought about that, it was like because Warcraft already had 3 games under their belt, right? DC Heroes, Marvels, those also have attempts at MMOs as well. That translated into this huge success. But for example, in your analysis of Star Wars Galaxy and Conan's MMOs, they didn't do so well. And some others, like Lord of the Rings, still exist, but they never achieve, I think, what people expected them in the first place. So is a pre-established IP enough to get people in? Or just it was a wild coincidence when it came to games like WoW?
I think at one point it might have been, but as things progressed, people started to expect a lot more from companies that had existing IPs. So when Star Wars Galaxies came out, or I guess was rumored to come out back in 2002, people were already expecting, basically everything that was advertised. They were talking about space and seamless interaction between the two. And of course, when the game came out, there wasn't space yet. They had to release an expansion to do that. I think fans were rightfully annoyed about that. And that kind of was an example of, even though Star Wars was this massive IP, people were still very critical of it. And some people call that nerddom or like fandom. Mm-hmm. Like the really big fans of certain games are going to be harsher on the way things are realized. Mm-hmm. But so it's like a double-edged sword, I would say. It's like you have the big hoopla, let's say a Walking Dead MMO is announced or Game of Thrones MMO is announced. You're going to have all of this press about it and people are going to be excited. But that all stops once they get into the game. Once they get into the game, people will have a super high expectations of what they want their favorite, universe to be. And when it doesn't meet those expectations, I think those games fail much quicker. Mm-hmm. But the only exception I can really think would be Lord of the Rings. It's managed to survive for quite a long time now, with, I would say, enough of an audience to continue to make it money, obviously. Mm-hmm. And that's probably because it's very lore rich and it's Lord of the Rings and everyone's really a big fan of the genre. But I think, yeah, it's a toss up. It's going to be a double-edged sword for sure.
Well, once you get a decent population, and that, of course, that's another thing that I think one thing that World of Warcraft really changed was the numbers, right? It became not so much about 100,000 or 300,000, even a million players at its height. World of Warcraft boosted, although that's not the case anymore, 13 million players. It's gone down very, I think now it hovers, depending on whether it's regular play or they release a new expansion, between 5 to 8, which is still a lot, especially for a subscription MMO. But one thing I noticed about, and we talked about, decreasing numbers of players in the player base, is that you often have a divide between the core player base and the need to create and establish that player base and attract new players and try to convert them into the expanding core. And I've seen from multiple examples that there's almost always seems to be a clash, especially when it comes to updates. You update the game so that perhaps you either attract new players, but that tends to anger the older players, or you try to give what the older players are being asking for, but it might be too complicated or too far down the line for the new players, because they may have to say, if, for example, more structured play, they have to be level 40 or 60 or 80 to get there. But I'm not going to experience that. I'm playing the same thing at level 1 to 20, for example, with no change. Yet I'm supposed to pay more money for this new expansion that I may see at some point. And we finally have Justin on screen.
Yeah. I figured it out. Sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. So repeating that, I mean, that tension between the established core and attracting new players, that seems to be something that has hurt, if not killed, many a game that you covered. And so, again, how do you keep that balance, right? Because you want people who are willing to pay, and we'll get to microtransactions in a moment, and are going to be, whether it's subscription or microtransactions, people are going to be there constantly playing. They are your core. But at the same time, the more people you have, the better. How do you balance that? I mean, how do you see the successful MMOs have managed to balance that versus the ones, most of the ones you covered, which haven't been successful, seem to have failed at some level or another, whether it's a new update or just failure to update on a regular basis, or etc. How do you think we might balance that?
Yeah, I think MMOs are the most unforgiving in pretty much just about every way, because so Mass Effect Andromeda had a lot of issues when it came out, but then it had this 1.0 patch that fixed a lot of the animation issues. Obviously, it wasn't enough to save the game in a lot of people's eyes, but it was still enough to make it playable for some. And an MMO, just especially a subscription-based MMO, really can't afford to make that mistake, because within their first month, if you cannot retain your player base, at least like a good amount of your player base within your first 1 to 2 months, you're going to lose so much of your funding. Because the thing I learned whenever I was doing my Hellgate video is the business manager on the game and for the company said something along the lines of, we don't really care if we sold 1 million copies. We would care more if we could have 200,000 people pay subscription for a year, right? It's much more money and much more support that way. So I think a lot of MMO's success is kind of, it's almost like misleading. Like if you look at ArcAge, how it was early on, its early success, I would say, is indicative of how well it was going to do. But say a game like Aeon or Warhammer, these games that were subscription based, they had these monster numbers and were able, even Age of Conan too, where they were able to sell 1 million copies. Age of Conan could sell a million copies, but because those people weren't willing to pay the subscription fee, it didn't really matter. And then once your game can't fund itself, basically, or get out of the red, I feel like they start to go into damage control mode and really just focus on things that they think are going to get people back playing the game. And it's almost like you start, like when an MMO launch, it already starts in a hole in most cases, because extreme cost, like we were talking about earlier, you're talking about sometimes these games being up to 100 million to develop. So your extreme costs, but not just that, you have a constant drain because you have to keep your servers up, your infrastructure, your CSR reps. It's not like, let's say, Uncharted, a game where you can launch it and then you don't have to really necessarily worry as much about online or constant updates. And in an MMO, people are expected to see some type of like normal update occurrence. Like they want to see regularity. They want to see expansions come out. They want to see the game that they're playing constantly evolve, because that's the appeal of an MMO, is to constantly see the game evolve. And so they always start basically not at 0. They start at -10, -20, and they have to make leaps and bounds to even just get back to 0. And whenever the game is in the red and it's failing already, it's so hard for them to get out of that hole, because it's not just about, oh, you guys sold 1 million copies. Great. It's like, yeah, we covered our cost. Now we need to actually make money and
sustain.
Right. Exactly. And where you're talking about between, I guess, where the balance is for that, I find that if you're going to be a subscription-based MMO, you can't really afford to change your model so drastically so early on. I feel like that really turns people off. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about that. It's like, when a subscription-based MMO goes free to play, for a lot of people, it's seen as a failure already, just because they had to drastically change their business model. Meanwhile, there's certain games that have been able to, I guess, eke out a little bit of an existence, having very fair and tone down business models. Like Lord of the Rings, for example, survived for such a long time because of that, basically. So yeah, people can complain that the business model, it's always trying to like entice you to want to pay money, but you don't have to. You don't have to pay money. So, and even if you do pay money, it's going to be less than, say, you would spend if you were going to pay a subscription if you're just a casual player, right? But if you want to, there's certain things that you can buy and buy certain expansion packs. You don't have to have a subscription fee to use them, but if you do, they unlock all of those for you. I feel like it's pretty fair. And SW Tour, to a lesser extent, I think their issue with SW Tour is if I want to use Lord of the Rings as a good balance, SW Tour was a little bit skewed in the pay to win kind of way, because they have lock boxes where you buy it and it unlocks a rare gear and rare mounts or whatever else. It's essentially gambling. I mean, a lot of these MMO companies have gotten away with putting gambling into their games. Arcade did the same thing, where you pay money and maybe you get a chance to get the gear that you want, or maybe not. And the unfortunate thing is, as much as we would like a balance, once these companies get a taste of that kind of money, I think it's really distracting for them. Like Arcade, to me, is one of the best examples of that. Once they realize that they could make their game free to play, right? AKA require your players to pay an inordinate amount of money just to be able to keep up with other players. They came up with a really good business model, because it's much easier to sell somebody something when you already give them a little bit of something. So when you go to a car dealership and they're like, hey, we'll give you a test drive, and then after you get the test drive, you're like, I kind of really like the car, right? You want to buy it.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with an MMO. Like, demos don't really exist anymore. Trials don't really exist anymore. So now it's more of like, if we can give you some free part of the game, maybe like a tutorial, or allow you to play through the whole game, but like hamper you in certain ways, like experience. But like, that's what SW Tour does. They limit your experience gain and limit the amount of credits you can have. And so you'll play it, but then eventually you'll be like, I gotta spend some money if I want to really play the game. And once Treon tasted that success off of making all of those lock boxes and RKM, random generated armor sets and whatever else they did, they realized that they could do that to all their other games. So if you look at Treon as a company before that, they had subscription-based games, but after that, they made all their games free to play because they realized that was way better of a business strategy. And in one of the Death of a Game videos, I also mentioned that about, I believe it was, I want to say City of Heroes. City of Heroes had a jump in population and was more profitable once they became free to play versus not being free to play, because it's a lot to ask somebody to pay a set amount a month when they don't know what they're getting for it. Like, some people are like, what am I really getting for this? Are you just allowing me to play the game? Is that pretty much it? Meanwhile, these free to play / freemium games, it's very clearly outlined. If you pay your premium, you get this XP boost, you get da 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 da. So people are like, oh, okay, so I can play it like this, but I can pay money if I want to play it like that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, except I think greed kind of ends up being a problem, because the companies realize that this is a really good business strategy. We can make a lot of money off of it. And then they start selling, like in the video I'm about to release, All Points Bulletin. Once the company that resurrected the game realized that they could just sell guns, then they started selling a bunch of guns. and no, there was no progression anymore. You didn't have to go through and unlock, and maybe buy the more expensive guns. People just pay $10 and they get the sniper rifle, and then it was just, that kills the population. But it makes them a lot of money.
Until it doesn't.
Yeah, until it dies, basically. Until it slowly bleeds out.
Yeah.
essentially, is what
Well,
happens.
I am probably of the school that I'm very reticent when it comes to microtransactions. I understand the business model, right? If you are not charging me anything to get access to your product, there's no initial barrier, but you're making a product in order to make a profit. You got to make a profit somehow. And I really don't want to have adverts and advertising and stuff like that. It'll be annoying. I've seen games try to do that as well. I remember one sci-fi, I think Korean game, sci-fi mecha game that had adverts on it. It wasn't good, especially in older connections, slower connections. Because I always feel, I suppose, and again, we go back to Ultima Online, stuff like that. I feel like it's somewhat the victory of the gold sellers. And people who remember gold sellers, and they're still around in many places, where essentially you're buying, if not necessarily power, you're using money, extra money to get things that you normally wouldn't be able to get. And I think my old-fashioned, coming especially from being mostly single player game as well, it's like I pay you money, you give me the product, I play it. If you want more money, you got to give me actual content, which of course you have to put that into quotations, because what does content mean? Does it mean 10 hours of questing? Does it mean new characters? What does it mean? But I usually go with content being more playable, expansion on the play. So I had no problems paying $20, $30, $40 for expansions for MMOs I play. Because for me, that feels like more content. When someone comes to me and says, oh, by the way, give me $5 for a beautiful flying unicorn with butterfly wings, I go like, no, I think that to me, and it's hard to explain, of course, feels like that should be just part of the game, right? In many ways, it's like, okay, if I do a quest, I can get the unicorn. And many games do that. They do a split, like, well, you can spend the time or you can spend the money. But I also feel, and also my stuff I've done with people probably heard of whales and dolphins and otters and all sort of gambling terminology, that in many ways they turn the grind against the players as well, right? Yes, you can get the stuff if you keep playing, no problem. But do you really want to wait when your friends already are flying at 300% faster to the skies, and they go and they record a video with their new armor that looks so shiny? That's okay. That's okay. I mean, I live in an apartment complex, so if you hear like some loud noise, it happens. But we're doing it live, man. We're doing it live. So it's one of the things I still haven't sort of gotten used to that yet. Also, talking about that's something, another thing that happened during this time, that you had transition from mostly subscription based to now free play, freemium with microtransactions. Aside from the idea of greed, could it also be the fact that the cost of making games ballooned to the point where it wasn't just enough saying, okay, we're going to give you, give me $60 for the original game, and maybe a year from now you pay 20 extra for an expansion, something like that. That wasn't enough to keep these games going?
I think it really was that when I talked to Richard Garriott about sort of the MMO market at one point, he mentioned that he found that back in the day, people used to look at free-to-play models and microtransactions, which have existed for a long time. I mean, they've existed since early 2000s. But people don't know of them unless they played those sort of games. And a lot of Western markets especially would kind of look at that and just scoff and say, that's a silly model. Like, that's stupid. Like, why would you make a game free and then charge these things like whatever else? And then next thing you know, 10 years later, everyone is doing it. I think really, in my personal opinion, is that there wasn't ever an MMO that existed except World of Warcraft that warranted the $15 a month like subscription fee. I mean, if you look at all of these other games, they were so incomplete, like Warhammer, incomplete, buggy, tons of server issues. Age of Conan, the same thing, lack of content, buggy. Just they were already, when they launched, they were incomplete games. And I think that was largely because they were so expensive that they had, like, so when a product launches and it's already like messed up in some way, maybe it has a bug or whatever else, that's almost always because it was rushed, right? Like business managers look at a product and say it needs to launch by this point. This is the most efficient time for it to launch. It's going to make the most money at this point. But also they look at we've been in development for too long. WildStar is the perfect example of that. That game was in development for almost 7 years. They didn't have a choice. They had to push it out. Mm-hmm. And look at it now. It's this big, terrible failure. Mm-hmm. But they didn't have a choice at that point. They just had to basically say, all right, just launch it and let's hope that we can do something with it. So I would say, I think it's partly because games haven't really warranted subscription fees. And so that's okay. They don't have to ask for a subscription fee. They have to have a different business model. But then it goes kind of like you said, where it's like, well, now if you want to make an MMO that has this new engine and crazy performance and whatever else, all the bells and whistles, it's going to cost you more money than it did back then. And I think if you look at Star Wars Old Republic, it was a good example of that. They spent a lot of money on their ad campaigns and their voice acting because people thought that would be a cool feature to implement in the game. Well, it probably was overkill. Like a lot of people just skipped through the dialogue anyway. I thought most of the story was okay. It was good enough, but it was not better than a single player game. So really it was like this awkward hybrid of single player and an online game. So for an MMO to come out and really promise all those things that people want, it's super expensive and it takes a long time. And look at the crowdfunding right now. Star Citizen's been in development for, I think, 5-6 years at this point. It's been a long time, and people were like scoffing, oh, it's never going to come out, it's never going to come out. And I get it, it has been taking longer than people would think, especially with the budget that it has. But MMOs take 4, 5, 6 years to launch. Like, they take a long time to launch, and the worst part about that is at some point you have to make a decision. What's your platform? What engine are you going to use? And next thing you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, your engine is super outdated, and it doesn't play the same way anymore. Warhammer is a perfect example of that. It's just like the engine was so dated. It was just nothing. I mean, they basically said that they didn't have a choice but to go with a older engine because it was more stable, and they didn't want to have to worry about creating their own engine, which is a big undertaking. So it's more cost efficient that way. But yeah, I think that you're seeing an increase in cost in games, but also you're seeing people, I guess, smarten up, I would say, in most cases when it comes to subscription fees. They say, is this really worth me paying a subscription fee to? Now, the unfortunate part of that is that they walk into a free-to-play game and end up paying more money than they would have originally playing a subscription game, which a lot of people don't realize is that if you're really into a certain MMO, they will nickel and dime you like crazy. And next thing you know, instead of spending the, $200 a year or whatever it would be, you're spending a lot more than that. In fact, ArcAge players were spending $200 in a month. So, I mean, there's a reason why, when it comes down to it, when a game starts to cost more money, people look for other streams of revenue. And since people aren't really paying subscription fees in the same way they used to, now you have these free-to-play or freemium business models where they will nickel and dime you everywhere they can. And they, in some cases, they will literally put ads in your game for you to upgrade your subscription service. So it's a combination of the two.
Good thing you mentioned Star Citizen, because I did have an interview about a year ago with the designers of one of the designers of the Dragon Shadowrun trilogy of games. That was also crowdfunded, single player game. Although they did have something of an online component because you could create, like Neverwinter Nights, you could create your own adventures and share them.
Yeah, modules. Yep.
Modules. I tried to do that, but it wasn't as developed, at least in the versions I played, to be easy to, as you used to say, the engine in Neverwinter Nights, at least the original. Neverwinter Nights 2. Well, this is not the time to talk about that. Maybe some other day. But one of the questions was how to avoid crowdfunding bloat. But I think it goes even more than that, right? It goes, for example, MMOs, usually their graphics are almost never top of the line. Because one of the reasons that we talk about also players is that you don't want, people who say bought an but off the shelf machine to not be able to even touch your computer and only see the PC elite, spend $1,200 or something, and you can spend much less. I know chat probably is going to get like, oh my God, you don't have to spend $1,200. Just saying, spend X amount of money, not get the best out of their machine and their experience. So you have to create a situation. Again, we go to World of Warcraft and other games as well, where they have a more cartoonish feel. Because I think one of the problems with Conan was they tried to do a more realistic version of it when it came out. And not only was that more expensive, it can get so easily dated, right? All of a sudden, this looks great today. 6 months from now, there's a new engine, whatever. This looks like it's something out of the PlayStation 1 era or something, right? And that can also turn off a lot of people, right? That's another factor. So you're always trying to both future-proof your product by having the best up front, which can lead you to increase, that sort of bloat or adding more features and doing more things, but also protect yourself by not, saying in graphics, for example, not have the latest, so that more people can play. And that to me is, and in Star Citizen, I think part of the problem, what I've seen, and as an outside observer, of course, is that they keep making promises. Oh, we're going to have an FPS module. We're going to have this and that's like, wasn't your game just about, remembering, Wing Commander, right? Bringing Wing Commander to the forefront. That's why a lot of people originally got into it. They want to just have spaceships and being their own personal fighter squadrons, and they're beautiful. And now you have an SPS module and carriers, and you're charging $10,000 for a luxury yacht in space, and that seems to be. I think their business, particularly, has become, as long as we can keep the idea of the game alive, people will pay for the eventual release of the game someday. And I think that's what a lot of people have sort of tweaked on, and they get angry about it. Of course, the average AAA, a couple of years ago, the average AAA game would take about 3 years to develop on a healthy schedule. Now it's around 5. So it's still very much within its, logical development cycle, if you think about it.
Right.
And again, we don't, a lot of information, we were talking about this before we started the program, we don't have a lot of financial information, which brings me to that question. Where do you get your data, man? Because you seem to get some very juicy tidbits when it comes to financial data, etc. Where are you most of your, you don't have to mention specific sources, of course, you have to protect your sources, but give me a snapshot of your sources and where you look for, etc.
So when I first start sourcing and just looking for data or just general research, I start on the whatever game or company I'm covering, I start on their wiki page, I go to their citations, and I basically just look at all of their citations. A lot of them will talk about more general things, not always business things. But I've also found, funny enough, I found a lot of data just randomly searching things. I remember when I found some of the NCSoft data on City of Heroes, I think people had already done the work for me, because they were trying to analyze why did they kill City of Heroes when it was proven to be financially successful and continued to make money. So whenever I was looking around, I found all these other people who found somehow found PowerPoints of meetings and things like that would show financial data. And so really I have the crazy, nerd fans to thank, because they do all the work and I just find their work really. So I would say in most cases, I've kind of just stumbled into it. But in other cases, it's just all about following the chain of events. I follow the game, all the articles and data before it launches, then try and follow it during and then after. And you'll usually find things like how many copies this thing sold, how many this it sold. And some people have found ways to come up with ways to analyze financial data using those numbers. When I did the Tabula Rasa video, people had essentially came up with figures that they knew that the company was making just based on, they took the amount of copies the game sold, the amount of people that were subscribing to it, and then the amount of time that they subscribed for. And then they came up with, they at least made this amount of money.
As a base, yes.
Right. And so people knew that at least if they couldn't make the cost of the game or the cost of how much it was to uphold the game. In the case of Tabula Rasa, since it was such a massive budget and overspent and everything else, they very easily knew that although the numbers that they had were okay if the game was not so much in the red, but since it was already so much in the red, the financial data basically showed the writing on the wall that it was going to die. So I think companies will guard that with every fiber of their being. But there's always people who maybe were part of the company who got angry at the company and they want to spill the beans. Those people will give you a lot of data. I know with Warhammer, there was a source who notoriously talked about how much money they spent, or SWTOR spent on their budget. That's where people sort of got that information. He wasn't even part of that team, but he just leaked that. And then there's the guy I mentioned for All Points Bulletin, who he was part of the dev team. He leaked all this information about the inner workings of the company and different things like that. So I would say out of all of those, it's probably the most common. I either stumble upon it randomly. I'm just going through a bunch of things and it ends up coming up, or other people will say like, oh, check this out. And they'll give me some sort of source or inside information about the workings of a company.
I think some of that data, I mean, not all of it, and you have to protect your secrets, of course, especially how games are actually made, because, you know, you don't want someone sniping your products or your people that are in, because they're going to, I'm going to get, you know, $10,000, $100,000 bonus to that guy who is key to your team and your graphics. So, whoops, there it goes. You can't do this anymore to get a substitute or something like that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think a lot of this data will actually, if it were more publicly available, would increase the trust between the consumer and the companies, right?
Right.
It's the appearance of secrecy and the absence of information that tends to have people speculate, right? And then rely on unsourced or poorly sourced information, or people behind the scenes. Oh, this person told me, but of course that person never been on camera, didn't give their name, etc., etc. So it builds there. I think another aspect, Richard, you talked a lot between 2008 and 2010. We're going to get a little bit on history and that real world history in a moment. But one of the things also is I noticed there were a lot of companies sort of seemed to be rushing to make MMOs. Even later on, for example, we had ESO, right? Bethesda, Cinemax, which is their parent company, had
right.
Bethesda create a MMO out of the Elder Scrolls franchise. SWTOR, also Star Wars of the Old Republic, BioWare for EA, and they had the rights to Star Wars, and they had done Knights of the Old Republic before. But sometimes, like especially those two games, they don't feel like a good fit for MMO in the first place, right? They feel like, and it's going from feeling from the outside observer, that it was like, oh, everybody's making a lot of money MMOs, or at least this one company, Blizzard, is making a lot of money in MMO, so we can also cash in. And they rushed into doing it. It's not necessarily the best product or the best portion of their IP. And while not necessarily crashes and burns, ESO and SWTOR are still around. They're still current, for example. They do suffer from, for example, having a very fast turnover from subscription base to free to play, or even the decision of not starting free to play in the first place. So sort of like a misunderstanding of the market. And probably many other companies were putting out during this time a lot of MMOs or attempts at MMOs, because it became sort of the white whale of the video game industry. And that has led to a lot of games dying. I mean, how true you think that is? Is this speculation, or does the data back that up?
I mean, crowdfunding wouldn't exist if big investors and companies were still throwing money at the MMO market. Like crowdfunding, I mean, technically it would exist, but it wouldn't exist in the capacity that it does. Like people will complain like, oh, great, another early access crowdfunded MMO or another survival game that's crowdfunded and da-da-da. And it's like, well, those exist because not a lot of companies are looking to throw money at those genres in the same way that they might have, at one point used to want to, because they've seen the market and the constant trouble that it's gone through. And they thought, I don't really think it's worth all of that. And that's like the issue with an MMO. It's like buying an apartment complex. It's going to cost a lot of money up front, but you're hoping that after a while you can make enough money based on people paying rent that you can then be profitable. But that will take years to get there. It's going to take, at least 2, 3, 4, sometimes more years to be able to start to become profitable. But then after that, it's all gravy, right? You're going to be making more money. At least that's what you expect. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of how people saw MMOs, is like, well, it's a lot of investment up front, but then you're going to start to make a lot of money. But obviously they realize that it's a lot harder than people think to keep a player base and maintain that player base, and not just maintain it, but continue to grow it. And like WoW, when it first came out, it had 1 million, I think, subs within the first, I want to say, a year that it was out, and that was like pretty good for the time. Mm-hmm. But that was nothing compared to what it hit in like 2009 and 2010 when it was in its heyday, and it was, I think, up to 10 million already by then, and then continued to grow from there. I think that once these companies realized it wasn't as easy as they thought, they took a step back, and crowdfunding took a step forward, and you started to see developers say, hey, I have this really cool idea, but I can't really fund it on my own, so why don't you help me fund it? And then that's sort of what's been happening now. The unfortunate part of that is that obviously it's hard to hold the developer accountable, even though you're paying their bills. Mm-hmm. It's hard to hold them accountable because it's not like you're like their investor per se in the same way, because an investor in a company, like a major investor, could just say, well, I'm going to pull funding, and then that company will die if essentially they don't listen to you. Mm-hmm. But as a person, at crowdfunding, you can still have 100,000 other people say, well, I'm just going to give them more time. And maybe they're delusional. Maybe it's sunk cost fallacy. Maybe they just want them to succeed so much so they don't look like a failure. But at that point, it's pretty hard to have control over what goes on. And so back to what you were saying about keeping their financials and stuff secret. The reason why I personally don't care about knowing all financial data about a certain game is as long as your communication is good, mm-hmm. and as long as you're constantly showing the community what you want to do, what you're doing, what your issues are, how you're fixing them, then I don't care how the sauce is made. Mm-hmm. Because when I go to a really nice restaurant, right, when the presentation's good, my waiter's good, everything else is good, I don't say, okay, so how was the sauce made exactly? Mm-hmm. I'm fine with it. The sauce tastes good. I'm good with it. But the problem is that a lot of these games they don't meet expectations. So then everyone's like, well, what did you do with all this money? Like, you had $100 million, and how did the game still turn out to be so crap? How come your servers don't work? How come the servers are crashing every single day? So I feel like people really want to know the financials once it starts becoming more of a failure. So that was just to follow up on that point. But then you can actually take the concept of crowdfunding, the period from 2009 to 2011 or so, of all these big investors putting money in, and you can look at that in other markets. For example, when Uber came out, right, they really disrupted the taxi market because they had basically no overhead, because all the business is taking place with an independent contractor, and the independent contractor was able to make more money because they didn't have to pay some taxing company or taxi companies, a big percentage of whatever else. So it was like very beneficial to all sides, and so they were making like bonker monies, and so was I can't remember that company that rents out the private apartments or whatever.
Yeah, I know.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Same thing. Yeah, same thing with them. Airbnb versus if you have, I don't know, like me, if you have Mr. like NerdSlayer's, taxi company, but I come in with like $100 million, and I'm like, yeah, I'm really going to make something out of this. I'm not guaranteed a return on my investment. Nobody's ever guaranteed. So it's like, people are a lot less willing to put money into things when they think A, the market's already saturated, or B, it's too technical or complicated of a market to get into. And I think that's what investors started to realize, that this is a lot more complicated than we originally thought. But they also realized that as much as people like to hate on World of Warcraft, Blizzard did a lot of things right. And that's how they've been able to maintain a lot of their fan base, because a lot of them are loyal to the game. So
Yeah, well, I was going to say the bigger issue in that particular time period, of course, was the Great Recession, right? And I think that kind of also worked on subscription base. And you heard that thunder. That's because there's, yeah, the weather is getting really nasty here. And the reason I say that is because when people feel that their finances are personal finances are a little bit of an issue, they're going, okay, where do I cut costs? And if, like you said earlier, you can't justify this monthly payment, it's much easier to cut off $15 or $20 or $30 every 2 months, etc., than say a car payment or a house payment or a cell phone, or something like that. It's much easier to cut those out. It's like, well, I don't have to watch Netflix this month or whatever. I don't have to play this game right now. I can just pay one solid amount of money for it, or play the free to one, and if I have any spare change, I can buy that thing that I really like, etc. I feel like you're more in control. So I think the combination of rising cost as well as the financial disturbance in the American market and the world markets, I think really contributed to the change in a way I think nobody has really studied as of yet. But I'm sure they had to have some impact. Although we still have companies that are survived and done very well. For example, Electronic Arts had the financials I've seen, they lost concurrently 3 years in a row. They were losing money. The stocks were very low. However, they survived because they had deep pockets. And other companies who supposedly were making money, all of a sudden they shut down their doors. Right? I believe the publishers behind Saints Row were the ones who, after Saints Row 4, Saints Row 3, they couldn't do it anymore. They just, one moment they seemed to be making money, and the next they were out the door because their pockets were not as deep, their coffers were not as deep. So it's on a case by case basis. But I also like to say that something I think was happening as well, that we talked a lot about PC gaming, because MMOs are associated with PC, but now one could argue that we're in a second MMO renaissance in a way. Mm-hmm. Except that the games that we're going to be talking about, nobody calls them MMOs, but they're MMOs. Of course, I'm talking about Destiny. Well, now Destiny 2 is going to come out. Destiny, I mentioned earlier, had over 25 million subscribers at one point or another, or users, because they don't have a subscription. GTA 5 also has a very powerful online, which is very much a sandbox type style game, and runs on microtransactions. I think they were making something like anywhere between $30 to $100 million a year just in microtransactions, buying the new car, the new jetpack, the new gun, the new thing. So very much a MMO if you choose to play it on the open servers, and it works a very similar way. But also between those two games, when we're talking about cost, is being estimated over $750 million, or $750 million, have been spent on developing Destiny and GTA 5. And as we come to the close of the hour, I have to ask you a question. What do you, if we are again in another sort of white whale hunt, what are some of the lessons that these new crop, especially console-based MMOs, could learn from the recent past?
I think to me, the biggest one that always stands out is don't do too much too fast, or don't try to do too much too fast. Because I think, honestly, Star Citizen is a big example of this. If they didn't keep promising their Alpha 3.0 or whatever it was called, the standalone like sandbox part of the game, people wouldn't be so angry or make all these memes about them. It's just that they kept promising more and more things. They're like, oh, now we can have the FPS part. Now we have you can be on a planet, and now you have this, and now you have that. And then it's like, you can promise all these great things, but if you don't have a solid core game, nobody really cares about all the excess stuff, because the core of the game has to be fun. And I mean, there's a ton of examples that prove that. In fact, there's certain games that do certain things really, really well, but are just really poor in other ways, like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, for example. Really good writing. It had a really good voice acting, but it also had the animations, like the voice animations. I think they call that mocap or whatever. They
The
even had that.
facial animation.
Right. They haven't had
lip
that
sync,
as far exactly as far back as, you know, I think 07 or 06 whenever it came out.
Mm-hmm.
But then it had all this other, you know, problems. The game was buggy. It barely ran. And so I feel like Eve did this really well as well. You need to build your core game, your base game first, and then worry about doing expansions and new patches and whatever else, because focusing on doing too much too soon is not only extremely expensive, it's super risky, because if you are a jack of all trades, that means you don't really do anything very well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why WoW is as popular as it is really because it is this jack of all trades, but it can afford to be a jack of all trades because its core game is already so well established. Everybody knows what a WoW game is. It's the carrot on the stick. You're chasing the carrot, and that's your sense of progression. You just keep chasing the carrot, whether it be gear, levels, money, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this constant form of progression, and that really keeps people going. But these other games, especially the games in the future, these crowdfunded games that are not yet out yet, like Camelot Unchained, Crowfall, Star Citizen, and there's a couple other ones too. What was it? Chronicles of Ilaria is one. Mm-hmm. And there's also that one that is using the Unreal Engine that people were pretty Ashes of Creation, I think it was called.
So I think I heard something like that. Yeah,
right. There's like 5 or 6 of these games that are yet to come out that are crowdfunded. I think they have to really focus on their core game, get the game working first, get the performance good enough to have enough people on the screen, and then worry about all the other stuff. But it's a hard sell, because it's not really easy to advertise our core game is working, right? Because people are like, yeah, it should be working. They want you to say, we have a massive yacht ship that you can fly around, and then, oh wow, that's so cool. Or you can seamlessly transition from space to landing on a planet. People are like, wow, that's so cool. Versus, you know, saying like, well, our graphics are just good enough to make the game run well. And I mean, if you look at Camelot Unchained, I follow that game a lot, and they'll come out with, we just had a beta test with a bunch of players and 1,000 bots. So we were able to have almost 2,000 players on screen. And that's really impressive and really cool if you're really into the, I guess, game design behind a title, especially in the MMO. You know that that's probably one of the most important parts of an open world MMO, a sandbox game, is how many people can you fit on the same screen? Because if you look at all these MMOs in the past that have had these big open PvP battles, it's usually so much lag that you can't even enjoy the game. And that was the whole point of the game in the first place.
Stuttering, you know, all the problems that come with it, loading, crashing.
Right, exactly. And if you can't, if your game can't run in the capacity it's supposed to be able to run in, which is an open world, then nobody cares about the other things. Because if there's issues with them being able to experience what they want to, which in Camelot Unchained, for example, or even Warhammer, was this big realm versus realm and battles and over castles and keeps. You know, if that doesn't work, then your whole basis of a game essentially doesn't work. So that's the reason why I think Destiny and GTA have had such success, is they are not massive in the sense of player count on a single server. Mm-hmm. What they do is they essentially take their little server clusters and say, okay, this one can only have 100 people. This one can only have 30 people. Mm-hmm. But there's still tons of people playing. You'll still encounter tons of people as you're playing, but only if you continue to go to these different servers or play with these different players. You still get the massively light feel, like it still feels massively. But you're not having to worry, like the game developer's not having to worry about having a server that can hold 100,000 people or 1 million people. Yeah. They only have to worry about their server, like in GTA's case, holding 64 people or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot more manageable, but it still has that big feel to it. So I think that's why these games, in particular, Destiny and GTA, are able to be successful online. And it's really fitting for me to end the conversation talking about the video that I want to release, All Points Bulletin. Mm-hmm. It pretty much was GTA Online before GTA Online was GTA Online, but it did so many things wrong that it ended up failing. But GTA Online, really, if you look at it, it's what APB was. or it was trying to be.
Which, talking about APB, people were asking for, it's like, oh, you created these wonderful cities. I want to be able to play with my friends and enjoy. And for a long time, Rockstar was very reticent. I mean, they started with the online playing on GTA 4, right? I mean, they've been games since the late 1990s, and only with GTA 5 did they go into this particular model. Of course, now they embraced it. Now it's microtransactions all the time. There was questions that they were trying to put the brakes on the single player modding, because it's really the multiplayer that it's giving them the success, right? So it is very interesting. We're seeing sort of a return to form of some of the places. We're seeing crowdfunding, but we haven't seen any successes from crowdfunding yet.
In an MMO format,
exactly.
Shovel Knight.
Was there were a lot of single player, but not in MMO format.
Exactly.
The nostalgic smaller team, one person garage coder, etc., which is an old term but still applicable in some cases. They're being successful, right? Limited, smaller. I can do this for $1 million and some change. But an MMO, which has a massive aspect to it and the online aspect to it, we haven't really seen any particular successes right now. Hopefully, we will see them in the future. I did want to finish the program with one game that has proven completely the opposite of everything that happened, and that's Final Fantasy 14, which is subscription-based and also has had a resurgence. At least if you're a Twitch follower and you see a lot of famous Twitch followers playing the game. I also played it. It looks great. The graphics are much better than stuff I've seen before. And it came back from death. And you made a video about that. Without going all over the video itself, because you have that on your channel. What a key feature or 2 or 3 key features of Final Fantasy 14 that made the comeback possible?
I think it has to be the team behind it. They were really passionate. I mean, if you watch the Life of a Game video I did on it, I showed scenes of the developers crying when they were talking about, hey guys, we're going to do this together. We're going to work on this. Like, we're not giving up yet. I mean, failure is such a terrible thing in Japanese culture that they refuse to fail. And they did the best thing possible when it comes to when you start to fail, which is just own up to your issues. If you look at pretty much every single game that I've covered, a lot of these people will just blame somebody else, blame this, blame that. Oh, the audience doesn't know what they want. Oh, this, that. And they always have excuses, and they just don't want to take it right on the chin, as the saying it goes. And I think that Final Fantasy 14 and their team, they definitely did that. They said that, you know what, we are completely sorry. They took their game down. They said, look, we're going to completely remake the core systems of the game because we're not going to give up. We're really going to dedicate ourselves to this. They had the game down for I think a year before they brought A Realm Reborn back on. Maybe even 10, 11 months, not even completely a year. And they brought it back. They said, hey, but stay with us, guys. There might be a little bit of issues at the beginning, but we're really still working on this. More expansions came. I felt that them obviously being, they have the advantage in the sense that Square Enix isn't a company that is going to just fold if an MMO doesn't work. Say any really of these companies like Real Time Worlds on APB or Mythic on Warhammer, those companies couldn't afford to fail. Their whole entire company. Another example was Troika when they did Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Right now, the game sold over 1 million copies. Back then, it sold I think 70,000 or something ridiculous. So it's like the companies who can afford to fail also have a little bit of that ability to take a step back, like Final Fantasy 14 did, and said, hey, let's bring the game down. Let's bring it back up whenever things start to work. So they did have a little bit of a cushion there, but even past that, you got to give them all the credit in the world that they took it on the chin. They said that, look, we know that there's issues. We're working on them. they brought the community into play. They said, hey, what do you guys think should change? What aspects did you like about the game? What do you think we should do with our further expansions? I mean, they have, in my experience, the best communication with their audience. And I think that's why they were able to make this resurgence. And honestly, I'm glad you brought them up, because I feel like besides World of Warcraft, they're really the only one who's been able to get away with a subscription model. And they have continued to be able to do it. But if you look at those two games, World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy 14, it's hard to match up against those games if you're a company who still wants to do a subscription model, because they have not only massive backing, Blizzard, Activision's one of the biggest companies in the world, and then Square Enix, of course, is also a big company in its own right. So it's a success, but it's a success with a grain of salt, I guess, in a way, because they still have to have all of that money backing them. I think, though, they were saying that Final Fantasy 14, if it wasn't going to be a success, it was going to be enough to severely hurt Square Enix. I think that's what they said at one point. And that's why they had so much riding on that game in its rebirth, which makes the story all that much better, obviously.
Well, we come up past a little bit of the hour here on the Lessons Learned channel. I'd like to thank Justin. It is NerdSlayer, for those who know him over at YouTube channel. Justin, can you tell us where we can find you out in the wild interwebs?
Yeah, so I have a Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv/NerdSlayer with 2 R's or 3 R's. Yeah, 3 R's. My YouTube channel is /NerdSlayer Gaming, or you can just look up NerdSlayer on YouTube. And then my Twitter, I'm actually going to look up my own Twitter. That's how much I know about. So my Twitter is @NerdSlayerG. And Discord's another way, but I would just go to my YouTube channel and then click on the Discord link there, because it's complicated for me to say what the URL is.
No problem. Yeah. So as Sokoros was saying in our chat, I love the idea of talking about and hearing about MMOs and the history. You can find a lot of videos there. That's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, because Justin basically does the life and death of video games, particularly MMOs. So it's a good place to start if you want to know the history of specific games, etc. We love to have him here, and also love to have all the people who came from the Discord into the chat. You have been lovely, so thank you for coming. And if you want to find my stuff, of course, you can find, I do a podcast every Friday at 9 about gaming, 9 Eastern US time, and as well as do more regular streaming on Twitch under Lessons Learned 1. That's the number 1, not the you don't have to spell it out. And of course, my Lessons Learned channel on YouTube, where I talk about video games that I like, dislike, and throw a lot of very weird and sometimes unpopular opinions about video games, but just to entice discussion and get the ball rolling. So I'd like to thank all of you in chat, as well as Justin, for being here. And if you like any video on my channel, please don't hesitate to comment and subscribe, and we shall see you when we see you. Have a great day. Good night.
See ya.